scholars in our research field, but also the coolest. You're gonna see soon, maybe me being the only exception, that each of the speakers is the coolest cat in the room. Indeed, this virtual room is a collection, a set of coolest cats. Some linguists, philosophers of language, and logicians believe that an absolute superlative is necessarily a set with one unique member, as for example, the highest peak of Africa, the Kilimanjaro, the tallest building on the planet, the Burj Khalifa in Dubai, or the largest river in water volume, the Amazon River. Even if this premise is correct, we have no paradox here for having a collection of coolest cats in the room, because each of our invitees is one of a kind. Thus, each one of them is incommensurably and uniquely cool. I also believe that each one of you in the audience of 955 attendees from 26 different countries is unique and cool as well. I would like to thank also João and Raya from Green Monkeys Web Design, Dave from Quarta Parede Graphic Design, and Carolina Meandro, our simultaneous interpreter, for being amazingly competent professionals. They are being paid. We are not exchanging publicity for work here, even though their dedication to our cause goes way beyond a merely pecuniary relationship. I couldn't forget to thank immensely the three members of our student organizing committee, Vitória Nicoliello, Tiago Carneiro, and last but not least, Bruno Moura, who has close ranks with me since day one in the enterprise of making this event possible. Having such a group of motivated and qualified students is not just having a valuable help with running errands. This process has also a formative role, preparing the young blood to assume our tasks in the future. Finally, I couldn't skip my very special manifestation of gratitude to my co-head, Professor Renato Cardoso, my collaborator, colleague, and dear friend. And now we want all to hearing from you, Renato.
Thank you, Professor Gabriel. I will be very quick, but I do need to say a few words. I'm Professor Renato Cardoso from the Federal University of Minas Gerais at the Faculty of Law and the Neuroscience program. I really just want to say that this event is a long time coming, and we expected to do this in person last year. But this has started much earlier. Since the first day I met Professor Gabriel, this has been a project of ours, and we would never imagine that we would actually have such a qualified group of keynote speakers, of invited speakers, and such a great group working with us in the organizing committee, and so many participants interested in the event, over 900. It's way above our greatest dreams from all over the world. And so I have to give credit where credit is due. We have been thinking about this event for a long time, but Professor Gabriel is the main force behind all of this. Nothing would be possible if he had been given so many sleepless nights, so many emails, so many phone calls, so much work. So Professor Gabriel, thank you very much. This is really your doing. So thank you very much, all of you, and let's hope this is just the first step for not only a Brazilian important group on philosophy of neuroscience, philosophy of free will and all this stuff, but worldwide effort to integrate these discussions. It's very, very good to be here and finally having this event taking place. Thank you, Professor Gabriel.
Okay, thanks, Renato. Before I introduce our keynote speaker, I want to introduce our discussant for her session. Marco Aurelio Alves has a PhD from the University of Texas at Austin under Michael Tai's supervision. And I'll be very briefly, I'll just say that he is the most competent specialist in the relationship of metaphysics and perception. And now let me present our keynote speaker. Our Our opening talk features a professor and researcher that symbolizes in a perfect way the type of interdisciplinary research our group preconizes. It is a great honor and pleasure to have her as our first keynote speaker. She has a BA in Humanities by the Yale University, MA in Philosophy, MS in Neuroscience, and PhD in Neuroscience and Cognitive Science by the University of California at San Diego. She has also a MSL by the Yale Law School. She is the Hellman Family Distinguished Professor at Dartmouth College, Professor of Philosophy and Chair of the Cognitive Science Program at Dartmouth College. In a personal note, I'm grateful to have had her as one of the authors who collaborated to my special edition to Frontiers in Decision Neuroscience called Decision-Making Experience under Philosophical Analysis, Human Choice as a Challenge for Neuroscience. Me and Renato usually call her one of the founding mothers of neuroethics. Without further ado, I want to let you listen to no one else than Adina Roskies.
Great. Thank you. Can you hear me, first of all?
Perfectly.
Great. And I'm going to share my screen. Do you see?
Yeah, perfectly.
Yes.
Okay, hang on a second. I am not seeing what I... All right, let me try one thing. Boy. Hang on a second. All right, are you now seeing the regular display or the presenter display?
The
Hello?
full display. Yep.
Presenter display looks full screen perfectly.
Okay, so you just see one slide at a time, correct?
Yes.
Okay, great. All right. So let me just say, first of all, that I am very happy to be here, but I would have been even happier to have been with you all in Brazil. It is an honor to be considered a cool cat and to be surrounded by all the other really cool cats that you have invited. So I am looking forward to an in-person version of this. That would be great to be able to talk to people in person. So today, given that the topic of the conference is free will and agency, I figured I'd talk about both those things. Let's start with something that Spinoza said over 300 years ago. He said that men are mistaken in thinking themselves free. Their opinion is made up of consciousness of their own actions and ignorance of the causes by which they are determined. Their idea of freedom, therefore, is simply their ignorance of any cause for their action. And if this is true, if freedom is just an illusion that we have because we don't know the causes of our action, you might think that we're in a different position now than Spinoza was in back in 1677. And that is, science has developed so much since then that we might be in a position to escape from our ignorance. And in particular, the brain sciences have given us new ways of examining the causal bases of behavior. We have new kinds of technologies, and we also have different disciplines that integrate thought and experiment from different approaches. And the confluence of these technologies and different perspectives might actually give us an opportunity to escape from the ignorance that Spinoza thought that we were subject to. So we can do things like image people's brains, figure out what neurons are doing using other methodologies, and perhaps understand the basis of human volition. However, I'm going to be a little bit deflationary with respect to the chances that neuroscience is going to allow us to escape from our ignorance. So what I'm going to start out with today is just talking a little bit about the philosophy of free will, giving you a sense of the landscape of free will. Focus for a little while on the problem of determinism, which is one way that neuroscience has tried to address the problem of free will. Then I'll turn to the question of the efficacy of conscious will and talk about what I'll call the classic model, and then talk about an alternative model that I favor. I'll sort of summarize where we stand with respect to neuroscience and the problem of free will. And then in the end of the talk, I'll turn to some new work on the topic of agency. All right, so I think that there are really two challenges from neuroscience for the possibility of free will. One I'll call the challenge of determinism, and the other the challenge of inefficacious will. So first, let's just think about what determinism means. So determinism is really a technical term, and it is there are various ways of spelling it out, but one way, and they all sort of amount to the same thing, is that if you had a complete specification of the state of the universe at some time and a specification of the laws, then you would have enough information to figure out what the state of the universe would be at all other times. So that's one technical way of cashing out the problem or the meaning of determinism. And determinism has figured very prominently in philosophical discussions of free will. So many people find the incompatibilist intuition that it's just not possible to have free will if determinism is true to be very compelling. And so some people think that determinism is true, and they embrace this incompatibilist view. So they would be people, can you see, hang on a second. All right, this is not, can you see a cursor? Maybe not.
Nope.
Okay, I can't get that to work. Okay, so on the bottom right, you can see this is like a 4x4 matrix where on the right-hand side, the possibility that the universe is deterministic, on the left-hand side that it's indeterministic, and then in the bottom part that we don't have free will, and then top that we do. So people who think that we don't have free will because they think the universe is deterministic and that free will is incompatible with determinism are hard determinists. But you might think that the universe is deterministic and think that does not preclude the possibility of free will. So those are the compatibilists. They live in the upper right corner, also sometimes called soft determinists. And then the other incompatibilist intuition is that, we don't, free will is not compatible with determinism, but the universe is indeterministic, and that it's in virtue of the indeterminism in the universe or in our brains, more importantly, that we can have free will. That group is called libertarian. So these are the general main positions on the nature of free will. And so as you see, the question of determinism figures very prominently in these kinds of philosophical debates. I'm not going to go into it, but many people have argued that if our brains are deterministic, then we don't have free will. And many people have said that this is that there are grave consequences that would ensue from the recognition that we don't have free will. Other people are much more positive about what would occur. But the real question I want to address is this threat really likely to be true? That is it possible for the brain sciences to prove that determinism is true? And so although many people have made claims that they've shown that certain brain processes are deterministic, I'm going to argue very briefly that no neuroscience is really going to show us that this metaphysical question of determinism is or is not true. I think there are two reasons for this. One, I call the problem of fundamental neural indeterminacy. And that is that we can't tell whether something that looks deterministic or indeterministic to us, so I'll call it apparent deterministic or indeterministic behavior, is indeed metaphysically deterministic or indeterministic. And it's this metaphysical question that's really important in answering this question about the possibility of free will. And so to think about it, it's really important to recognize that the only handle that we have on whether determinism is true is whether we can predict what the brain is going to do, if we're talking about neural systems. So can we predict what neural systems are going to do? That's the way that we can get some kind of grasp on this metaphysical question. It's the only operational measure that we have of determinism. But I'm going to argue that predictability really cross-cuts the question of determinism or indeterminism. That is, there are predictable systems that are indeterministic, and quantum mechanics is one example of that. So at the macro level, we have very deterministic material behavior, but at least our best interpretation of our best quantum mechanical theory at this point is that it's fundamentally indeterministic. So that's one example of how predictability doesn't really tell you whether something is deterministic or indeterministic. And the other example is chaos. So chaotic behavior can be purely deterministic, yet unpredictable if you don't know the governing equations for the chaotic system. And so merely looking to see whether we can predict what the brain is going to do in various situations isn't enough to tell you the truth or the falsity of the metaphysical question of determinism. So these epistemic issues, I think, are very problematic for any argument that neuroscience is going to give us the answer to the question of determinism. And the second reason that I think neuroscience isn't going to give us the answer is that the brain is a massive and highly interconnected, very dynamic system. It's impossible to really isolate a subsystem and suppose you could describe the behavior of every little piece of the subsystem. You couldn't really isolate it from the rest of what's going on in the brain without knowing everything about every part of the brain, which I think that neuroscience is just not in a position to do. So if you think about, for instance, the only animal for which we have a complete wiring diagram, we know every synapse and every neuron in the C. elegans. It's a flatworm, a tiny, almost microscopic worm with 302 neurons. And this is what the interconnectivity of that system is. And then you try to scale up this kind of picture to something that has 10 to the 10th neuron or 10 to the 12th neurons, with each of those making something like 1,000 connections. And you can see that if you try to, let's say, record from a neuron and predict what it's going to do, and let's say it does something that you didn't predict, then could you really tell the difference between an indeterministic event or a deterministic effect of something else that happened somewhere else in the system? And I would submit to you that that's just not feasible to do. And so I don't think that any empirical evidence from neuroscience is really going to settle this question of determinism. I think that if there's an answer to that question, the science that will give us that answer is going to be physics. But currently, for instance, there are both deterministic and indeterministic interpretations of quantum mechanics. And we also don't think that our current physics is the final theory. And so I don't think we're in a position anytime soon to answer the question of determinism. So just to summarize, I think that there's a challenge for arguments about neuroscience telling us something about whether the brain is deterministic, and that is that there's this fundamental problem in operationalizing determinism that makes empirical approaches problematic. And I would say also that there's no evidence to date that really bears upon the question of whether or not the brain is deterministic. Okay, so let's turn to the other main way in which neuroscience has tried to address the question of free will, and that is what is the role of conscious will in the initiation of action. So suppose you're standing on the edge of a diving board. This is the kind of initiation that I'm thinking about. You're standing on the edge of the diving board. The Olympics are coming up, right? So you're an Olympic competitor and you are poised to act, but there has to be a point in time when you deem yourself ready to actually execute this dive. So there's a point in time, time goes on, there's a point where there's a decision, and then that decision ensues in action, or at least that's the folk conception of how action initiation goes. And this folk conception has been challenged by a series of results in neuroscience that many of you will be familiar with. But since I'm the first speaker in this conference, I will at least introduce the experiment for anyone who isn't familiar with it, because I think it will be discussed by other speakers as well. So I'll call this the classic story, and it's the story of the readiness potential, which was, it's a brain potential that was first documented in the 60s by Kornhuber and Dieck, that's the 1960s. And it became very well known because Benjamin Libet used this as a measure for an argument that we lack free will, or that our conscious will is inefficacious. And I think because of the central role that the readiness potential, or the RP, played in these kinds of arguments, it spawned a very large literature that continues to be built upon about the nature of the readiness potential and on its impact on philosophical questions. So very briefly, this is the Libet paradigm. You have a subject, and the subject is hooked up to an EEG machine. So you're recording brain activity from the scalp. And at the same time that the brain activity is being measured, the subject is told to spontaneously move his finger or his wrist. So whenever he feels the urge, he or she feels the urge to move, they should move, and their motor movement is being measured by an EMG, so that we can know when in time the motor activity occurred. And at the same time, the person is also watching a TV screen or a monitor that has a clock with a little dot that goes around the clock. And the person is being asked to tell us by referencing where the dot is on the clock when they felt the urge to move. So just to show you what some of this might look like, you have somebody sitting up in the right hand, top right of the screen, being recorded in these two ways. What you see below is the mesh of recording sites, and we're going to look at the middle recording site, CZ. And if you ask somebody to move their finger, what you get prior to the movement, so the 0 time is the time at which they move their finger. And if you look at the brain potentials that precede that time, you see that it's quite noisy, but there seems to be at least a relatively steady rise that culminates in the point or just before they move their finger. So this is what the individual trials look like. And if you average those together, you get this kind of ramping activity that precedes the motion that Libet interpreted as preparatory activity for volitional movement. So what's the point of doing this? Well, what Libet was interested in doing is to measure the time of one's conscious will or consciousness of willing an action relative to the time of the neural signals related to the action. So the W time, or the time of will, the time at which the person reports that dot, or the point at which the person reports that dot being when they were aware of willing the action, allows the experimenter to reference when they were conscious of willing relative to what their brain was doing at the time. So that's the basic idea of the Libet experiment. And Libet's findings are quite well known, and that is that there is a brain potential that precedes one's time of willing, or the W time. As you can see, there's a little graph of how scattered the W times are, but the W time occurs before action, typically. People do report willing before they actually act, but if you look at the brain potentials, the W time occurs after the rise of that potential begins. And so Libet interpreted this the following way. This is from his 1983 paper. He said the brain evidently decides to initiate, or to at the least prepare to initiate, the act at a time before there is any reportable subjective awareness that such a decision has taken place. It is concluded that cerebral initiation, even of a spontaneous voluntary act of the kind studied here, can and usually does begin unconsciously. These considerations would appear to introduce certain constraints on the potential of the individual for exerting conscious initiation and control over his voluntary acts. And then the inference that was made, so the implicit inference is that this kind of conscious initiation and control over voluntary acts is necessary in order for our acts to be freely willed. So Libet thought that this was a real challenge to the possibility of free will. So just to show you what the data looks like, there is, you still can't see any cursor, that is very annoying. There is a ramp up, so let's look at what is listed here as a type 2 RP. So about 500 milliseconds before the action, there is a deviation from baseline, and the signal ramps up to a max that's right around the time at which the person makes the motor action. But it's another 300 milliseconds or so until the person reports being aware. So the average W time is about 200 milliseconds before action. And so there's this gap between, at least as Libet interpreted, when your brain decides to move and when you're aware of having decided to move. And so if we think back to that sort of folk conception of what goes on when people make decisions to spontaneously do things, or to do things that are not triggered by external environmental cues, the idea is that your brain gears up to jump about 500 milliseconds before you jump, but you only decide to jump several hundred milliseconds after that. Okay, so that Libet result really sort of called into question our folk conception of what's going on in the generation of action, but also about whether or not we could freely will to act. Now, Libet thinks that his experiments demonstrate that we don't consciously initiate our spontaneous actions. And remember that the kind of action that he asks, or that he's using in his experiments, are these kinds of simple motor acts, like spontaneously moving your finger or something. And so one question is whether this is really paradigmatic, a kind of paradigmatic free action, or if there's something defective in the way this experiment is saved up, is designed. Libet thought, even in this initial report, that there might be ways to save the notion of free will. So he said, maybe we have free won't. That is, maybe we could decide not to initiate the action in the time between when we became aware of our intention and when we actually acted. But subsequent experiments have shown that there's really not time to do that, so that there's a very small or maybe negligible window during which you could do it, because in fact, there's a point of no return that is also about 200 milliseconds before the action. So it looks like this possibility of free will is not a real possibility for saving free will. Libet also recognized that there are other kinds of actions that seem to be voluntary and that may still allow us to have the kind of control and conscious initiation that he thinks are necessary for free will. So he said, in those voluntary actions that are not spontaneous and quickly performed, that is, those in which conscious deliberation of whether to act or what alternative choice of action to take precedes the act, the possibility for conscious initiation and control would not be excluded by the present evidence. So he was aware even then that there are many other kinds of situations where free actions could occur, and that these kinds of experiments, even if his interpretation is correct, would not preclude the possibility of free will in those kinds of situations. And I might note that those are really, I think, mostly the kinds of actions that we really care about, because they're the ones in which you're deliberating and can be, let's say, held responsible for what you do. I mean, you're thinking about them, you have reasons for doing what you do. And it's really moral responsibility, I think, that is at stake with most of the free will debate. Okay, so I want to just note several different commitments of this classic view. One is that it's post-decisional. So the readiness potential is taken to be neural evidence of a decision to move that, let's say, your brain makes, if Libet is correct. So the decision is taken to be the point at which the RP deviates from the baseline, so about 500 milliseconds before motion. A second commitment, this is implicit, is that the RP is an ontologically real signal, that it's a readout of some kind of causally efficacious neural process. That process leads to action, and that it has this kind of distinct and measurable onset. And thirdly, the idea is that it's not conscious. That is, at least in these kinds of situations that Libet is exploring, the RP precedes subjective awareness of decision. Okay, so these three things together lead to the widely accepted doctrine that conscious will is inefficacious, and therefore that we lack free will. Now, the Libet studies have not been uncritiqued. So there have been many critiques over the years that include, let's say, the unreliability of the way in which he measures the W time, et cetera, the kind of paradigm which he uses in order to probe free will. You might think that, for instance, the being told in a laboratory setting to spontaneously move your finger periodically and randomly might really not be paradigmatic of a decision of whether or not to move, but really what you're doing is following instructions. And if you're deciding anything, you're deciding when you're going to move. You're going to move now as opposed to now, for instance. You might also worry that this kind of simple motor act, like moving your finger or moving your wrist, is not the right kind of paradigm for investigating free will. If you have this sort of simplistic view that all actions are just sort of an addition of or amalgamations of basic actions that you could add together, then maybe that would seem like a promising way to go in designing an experiment. But we have good reason to think that actions are not complexes of basic actions. So that's one reason to criticize the paradigm. And the second is that the idea that decisions in the absence of reasons, which is really what these Libet studies are really probably not the right kind of paradigm for talking about free will if what we're really fundamentally interested in is the question of moral responsibility. So again, I think making decisions for reasons is something that we really care about, but whether or not somebody does something when there's no reason to, if you're choosing between two options and there's absolutely no reason to prefer one or the other, we might not care which one is chosen. And then, as I said before, much longer timescales may be the ones that we should care about, as Libet himself noted, and there's lots of evidence, for example, Goldwitzer's implementation intentions that show that that long-term intentions have causal effects. And then my favorite criticism of the Libet study is that he's not really measuring the time of conscious intention, but rather a metastate, the consciousness of intention. So to understand this argument, just recognize that the Libet paradigm really involves two different tasks. One is to spontaneously move your finger, but the second task is to report the time of awareness of your intention to move your finger. And that requires several things. You have to recognize your own intention to move, and then you have to index the time, that recognition with respect to this external thing, the clock. So you have a shift of attention from an internal to an external object. And then you have to report the result. So where on the clock is the dot at that point where you've recognized that. So there's an attentional shift that takes time, but more importantly, recognizing that you have an intention to move is a metastate that depends on the intention to move. And it has to therefore be later in time than the intention to move, or if there's some kind of weird transparency, maybe it would be at the same sort of time, but most metastates take as their object a state that's already pre-existing. So I think that what the Libet study is measuring isn't really the W time. So where he had previously put W, I now put consciousness of intention. So the purple C of I is around 200 milliseconds. That's the meta state, which means that the W state, which he wanted to measure, has to happen sometime before that. And we don't know where in this kind of timeline the W state actually occurs. So one more way of saying it is what you're really interested in, for instance, is like when the red light, the light turns red and you're driving your car, you need to form an intention to step on the brake and then step on the brake. So you're interested in the time at which you decide to step on the brake. And that may be what we mean by conscious will. But the thing that Libet is actually measuring is not that, but rather the awareness of conscious will. That is the meta state of having an awareness of having the conscious intention of stopping. And, you know, I don't know about you guys, but when I step on the brake in my car, I am consciously doing it, but I am not aware at the time that I'm doing it that, oh, now I have an intention to step on the brake. I don't ever have thoughts about my intentions. I have thoughts about stopping the car or the red light, etc. Okay, so these are all criticisms of the RP. These are reasons to think that the Libet study does not, even under its own, by its own lights, undermine the possibility of free will. But let's sort of revisit work that's happened since then and figure out a little bit more about what we know about the nature of the RP. So first of all, it has been shown many times that the RP is a reliable signal that's visible in the EEG prior to spontaneous voluntary movement, but it occurs when you have multiple trials and EEG traces are time locked to the movement onset and averaged over these multiple epochs. So it comes from a bunch of noisy traces and it emerges from the averaging of many, many, many trials. We also know that the temporal extent of the RP seems to be related to planning. So if you have pre-planning, you get a longer RP, that is, it starts, the deviation from baseline begins earlier. We also know that there is a lot of variability in the RP. So there's variability across trials, but there's also variability across individuals. And it's really difficult to resolve the shape of the RP in single trials. So here's averaged RPs over many individuals. And you can see that for some people, the RP looks pretty much standard, very much like the group averaged RP that I showed you earlier, although here in many of these traces, the polarity is reversed. But in some of these, it doesn't look at all like that. So they all seem to have quite different shapes. And in addition, if you look at individual trials, you can see it's very, very noisy and hard to pull out anything that looks like a standard RP. In addition, at least there's anecdotal data that not all subjects exhibit an RP, even though they are able to perform the task. The shape and the onset of the RP seem to be highly variable. And if used to predict the onset of movement, it hasn't proven to be a very good predictor. You would think that if it's really part of this causal chain, that you would be able to predict upcoming movement by seeing when the RP began, but this the timeline doesn't seem to be standard. In an upcoming publication, Aaron Scherger's group has tried to use a machine learning algorithm in order to predict when somebody is about to move by looking at the RPs. And it turns out that if you control for anticipation, these kind of machine learning algorithms do very poorly at predicting the onset of movement until essentially right before the movement. So what they might be working on in the cases where there's no control for anticipation is a signal that's really not related to movement itself, but rather more to anticipation. Furthermore, it seems like there's lots of reasons to think that the RP doesn't reflect that someone has made a commitment to move, or at least sort of the content of the RP or the thing that it is reflecting may be something other than a commitment to initiate action. So the classic view is that it's reflecting the outcome of a decision to move or a commitment to move. But it turns out that it is possible to withhold movement after an RP is initiated, that the RP is present in tasks that do not involve a motor component, that don't involve a motor component at all, but do involve decisions that are non-motor. And it's also present in tasks involving decisions not to move. And so all of this is consistent with the RP being reflective of the decision process itself, or a decision process itself, not necessarily having made a decision to move. So these kinds of considerations have motivated what we'll call the stochastic accumulator account. And many kinds of psychology, many different psychological theories have embraced an accumulator to bound model of decision making, both at the neural level, but also at sort of different psychological levels. And this is work that was pioneered by Aaron Scherger and his group. And the idea is that the RP is actually the result of an underlying accumulation to bound mechanism for the initiation of action. So there are two ways that you could get an RP given sort of a Libet style paradigm where you're averaging over multiple trials. So one is one where you're averaging time locked to movement, many trials in which the underlying signal is an RP with noise on top of it. And the onset of that indicates the result of some decision to move, and whose temporal relation to movement is uniform. And if you had a bunch of RP-like individual traces and you average them together, you would get a less noisy RP. But it also turns out that you would get something that looks like an RP if you had an accumulator model of decision. So suppose instead of the ramp indicating that there has been a decision made, suppose that there are threshold crossings that are themselves indicative of the decisions that lead to movement. And what you get is sort of a diffusion and ultimate accumulation of in this case, it would be noise that leads to some kind of threshold crossing and time locked, therefore, action. And that would be something that looks like an RP. So just to show you what I mean, if you take this kind of diffusion to bound mechanism and you average all of the threshold, or you average all of the traces time locked to the threshold crossing, what you get is something that looks like the right hand EEG trace. So you see the empirical data and the model fits it very beautifully. And the other thing that's really nice about the accumulator model as a model for how you get the RP is that it predicts the distribution of mean waiting time. So if you ask somebody to do the Libet experiment and you just measure how long is it between their spontaneous movements, you get a certain kind of distribution. And if you take an accumulator model and you fit certain parameters, you end up being replicating that same distribution. So the stochastic accumulator account reproduces the distribution of wait times and the shape of the RP in a very sort of compact way. And the thing that's very nice about the stochastic accumulator account is, since this is a model of decision making in general, it can be used for making decisions that are not spontaneous. So when you're averaging, for instance, evidence together. So these kinds of models are used to predict perceptual decision making, for example. So when you have evidence, they can describe the dynamics of a system or decision making on the basis of evidence. But something like the Libet task is a task in which you don't have evidence that you're averaging over. It's essentially a task that's being driven by the underlying noise signal. And so you get a very compact account of decision-making in general, whether it's decisions for, let's say, reasons or evidence, or decisions in these kinds of cases where there's no reasons that are contributing to your decision, unless maybe an urgency to get on with it. Okay, so the main thing that distinguishes, or a main thing that distinguishes this accumulator account to the classic account is that the classic account is post-decisional. That is, the Libet style account of the RP has the neural decision to initiate movement to be the point at which the signal starts to deviate from the baseline, and that precedes the time of action by sometimes a second or more. And that is in contrast to the accumulator count, which is a pre-decisional account. That is, all of this time that happens prior to the action, there's no decision that's been made. The decision occurs very close to the time of action. And what you have beforehand is just the ongoing spontaneous fluctuations in neural activity that characterize the accumulator to bound model. There's a bunch of converging evidence in favor of a pre-decisional account. I note some of the experiments here. And in fact, Aaron Sugar and I have a paper that has just come out in Ticks that sort of gives a review of what we know about the RP now and this accumulator interpretation of what's going on. There is still some evidence consistent with a post-decisional account, but I think that this evidence is still, it's not determinative. It's really hard to know in all of these cases exactly whether one or the other model is being favored. I think that there are ways to interpret the results both ways. So let's turn to the implications of these stochastic models. If this accumulator count is correct, then the RP is actually a kind of artifact that emerges from the biased sampling that you have in the way in which these Libet experiments are structured, because you only average traces that result in action, right? You only average the EEG epochs that have action at the end, because there's no other way to index those EEG epochs. And so because of this kind of biased sampling, it doesn't necessarily reflect an underlying neural process that's present only prior to action, right? So there may be excursions that are very close to bound that occur frequently but don't lead to action, and we would never, using the Libet paradigm, see that those happen. If this is true, then there's no physiological significance to the onset of the RP. The RP onset, therefore, can't cause anything or doesn't reflect a real causal process. So the accumulator account really says that in these Libet style experiments where there are no reasons for moving now as opposed to a second from now, what's really driving the process is noise. But we can also have an accumulator count where the signal emerges from the time locking and averaging of a variety of potentially real neural signals. So it doesn't rule out the possibility that there are real neural signals that indicate motivation or volition or something that has some kind of link to intention. And as I mentioned, these stochastic models can underlie both evidence-based decisions and the spontaneous ones of the Libet paradigm. So consider again the three commitments that I talked about of the classic view, that it was post-decisional, ontologically real, and non-conscious. Given the accumulator model, what we have is something that is instead pre-decisional, where the RP reflects evidence that contributes to a decision to move rather than reflecting an already made decision to move. It's artifactual, that is, the RP is an artifact of sampling a causally efficacious neural process. That is the decision process, but the underlying signal has no measurable onset and may not resemble the RP in individual trials. And thirdly, we don't know what its relationship to consciousness is. The RP may reflect a signal that gives rise to subjective consciousness of decision or intention. Many people think that consciousness of decision or intention is a process or results from a process or a neural process. And so possibly the thing that the RP is measuring or indicating is part of that process. But we just don't have the experiments that really tell us what the relationship between the RP and consciousness is on this view. All right, so what I've presented so far is an alternative interpretation of the readiness potential. And then the question remains, well, what kind of impact does this have on the free will debate? So first of all, and very briefly, if the RP onset is something that is itself non-existent or meaningless, then relating the W time, the time of intention, to it is also meaningless. So this interpretation undercuts Libet-style arguments for unconscious decisions. Secondly, the decision in the Libet-style tasks under this view is due to noise. So in cases of spontaneous action, when we're asked essentially to act randomly and there are no other considerations for or against doing something, making one or another decision, what happens on this model is that we just let decision processes happen using noise or whatever kind of signal or mechanism can operate in conditions where the usual considerations for decision don't exist. Now, I think that doesn't really impact the free will debate in one way or another. In some ways, you might think, look, in these kinds of cases, since there are no reasons to act, then it's appropriate to just let the decision happen and come what may, because nothing rides on it. And so the question of moral responsibility also doesn't really arise on that in that circumstance. And so you might think that it doesn't really have very much import for the kinds of free will debates that people usually are involved in, where what's riding on it is moral responsibility. But there are more, we can dig a little bit deeper. So one thing that I didn't really state very clearly, but I indicated early on when I was discussing the philosophical conception of free will and the way in which it interacts with determinism, is the fact that I think the question of free will is not a purely empirical question. It interacts very much with different kinds of philosophical commitments and views. And I think that the stochastic accumulator model is no different. That is, it doesn't wear its philosophical implications on its sleeve. You have to think about what kind of philosophical position it might be interacting with. So for example, there are free will theorists called agent causation theorists who think that in order for some action to be freely willed, the agent itself has to cause that action in a way that's sort of separate from the causal nexus of the physical world. And I think that there's nothing in this accumulator model that would satisfy an agent causation theorist and make them feel like, oh, okay, here is, some kind of model that can support my notion of free will. But if you're a libertarian, for instance, if you think that what's important or what matters to whether or not we have free will is whether or not our decision processes or our brains are indeterministic in some sense, then it would satisfy a libertarian if it turns out that the noise is indeterministic. We've said nothing about the nature of the noise that drives the stochastic accumulator model. And indeed, I don't think that we have anything to say. I think noise can be deterministic and it can be indeterministic. And if what I said earlier in the talk is correct, I'm not sure that neuroscience is going to be able to figure that out. But let's say if it's indeterministic, then a libertarian might be quite happy with this model. Most compatibilists, I think, would be happy with this model. They can recognize that noise can effectively allow us to make random decisions, but that leaves open what other things can affect other types of decisions in terms of things like reasons. And so I think many compatibilists would be perfectly happy with the stochastic accumulator account. In addition, in the model, there is a deviation from baseline firing that brings the whole model close enough to the threshold that noise processes will lead to threshold crossings. You can think of that as task set or intentional set, but that itself could be a volitional signal. It could be a conscious signal. You might think that, just sitting in the experiment, the chair in the laboratory doing the Libet experiment, you've already volitionally and intentionally and consciously put yourself in the frame of doing what the experimenter asks and spontaneously moving your finger, and you're doing that intentionally and consciously. So there is room for the agent and conscious will to operate even in this kind of accumulator model, where what drives the particular actions might be noise. There are still some worries that you could have if you're a source compatibilist, where what really matters for your decision to be free is that it's somehow attributable to you as an agent. You might worry that if what's going on here is that the noise is driving the process, then you're not enough of an agent in these cases for you to have willed to do that. And I think that that's a reasonable worry, but I think in the scheme of things, for instance, for me, I think in these cases where I have no reason to do one or another thing or to act now as opposed to now, I'm not sure I care if these cases are up to me. I might just abdicate my own will to the nature of the neural processes that I'm relying on to make these decisions that just don't matter. Okay. As I mentioned, there are other kinds of models that you could offer that take the basic idea of a stochastic accumulator into account, but still you can interpret them as having more of a volitional overlay. So if, for instance, the neural excursions reflect something like motivational strength or motor ideation, then the threshold crossing events aren't entirely due to noise and instead are causally connected to volition. So this may be the kind of thing that will make the source compatibilist happy. And as I said, the task set is arguably volitional. And so even that kind of volitional component may be enough to secure agency or free will for decisions, and even possibly for agent causation theorists, although I would have to ask them. But I want to note that no one has seriously suggested that we have to be aware of all causal influences on our decisions for them to be free decisions. For instance, we don't have to know the nature of the neural processes that are operating in our heads that lead to decisions for them to be free. And there are lots of other causal properties that have been shown to have some kind of influence on decision making, but it's not at all, I think, plausible that in order for us to make free decisions, we have to have global knowledge of all the causal influences on our decision making. So to summarize, the classic, the Libet style post-decision models assume that the RP onset has physiological significance, and they open a space for comparisons between that onset time and the W time, and thus for arguments about inefficacious conscious will. But as I've argued, a family of stochastic models can equally well model RP characteristics. And under these models, the classic RP is a natural consequence of just the way in which the data is analyzed, but it doesn't entail that in individual trials, there's an electrical potential with the characteristics of the RP that signifies action initiation. Instead, underlying decision processes give rise to decisions that occur approximately at the time that we are aware of them occurring. So it's much more in line with our intuitive notions of free will and decision making. So none of these models challenges the efficacy of conscious will, but the model details, so I've talked about a class of accumulator models, but the model details, depending on whether it's a bumps model or a motor ideation model, et cetera, can influence the way in which we think about the decisions and the awareness thereof being related. All right, so I've been talking for about an hour, and I think we have more time, right? So I'm gonna move on to agency. So why do we care about this question of free will anyway? And I would offer that what we really care about is agency. And this is a concept that has become more and more prominent in the philosophical literature, but it hasn't become clearer. So at the very base, what agency is some kind of capacity to act. But when we talk about human agency, we mean something much richer than that. So it has something to do with being a rational subject, an actor in the world, self-determining. It's very hard to come out with a very clear definition of the agency. What I'm going to talk about today is an ongoing project, still in its early stages, that takes as a sort of fundamental notion the capacitarian idea about agency, that is that agency is a set of capacities, or depends on a set of capacities that we have to act in particular kinds of ways. And it is really sort of, I think, the folk or implicit concept that we have in both moral, that we invoke in both moral and legal responsibility. And so what I'm going to start with is the idea that there are many capacities that matter. And one way of thinking about these many capacities is that they sort of form axes in a multidimensional agent space. So you might think of like a very bare notion of agency could just take it to be a binary property. You either have it or you don't have it. Or you could think it's a graded property, but it's sort of a scalar property, so you can have more or less of it. But what I want to suggest is there are different kinds of agency, and you can think about how to characterize agency in this multidimensional way. And the reason that I started thinking about it is really because of new neurotechnologies that people are starting to use and treat people with, even though we don't really understand their impact. And the question that I had is there a way to improve our understanding of agency in order to allow us to think more ethically or neuroethically about these kinds of ways of intervening in the way people interact with the world? And I think that because there isn't any common framework to discuss agency, even within philosophy, but even more so, there's none to discuss agency across sort of philosophy and the clinic. I think that it would be useful to try to develop a clearer way of thinking about agency. And so this is actually a project that is funded by the Brain Initiative. And the project was really originally conceived of as one to look at the effects of neurotechnologies, and in particular deep brain stimulation. So deep brain stimulation is a technique that is used to treat different diseases, but in particular Parkinson's disease that has not responded well enough to medication. And so in deep brain stimulation, you actually implant an electrode deep into the brain of the patient and stimulate certain fiber tracts that alleviate some of the symptoms of Parkinson's disease. It seems crazy, but there are hundreds of thousands of people walking around with these electrodes in their brains at this point. And it really does help them operate in the world. And DBS has been approved for a number of illnesses and is being also tested now in clinical trials for other ones. So things that it's thought to be helpful in are, but beyond Parkinson's, OCD, treatment-resistant depression, Tourette's, anxiety, addiction, and chronic pain, and that's not an exhaustive list. So it's actually a very promising technique. Interestingly, nobody who uses it really understands how it works. Now, there are also a lot of negative side effects of DBS that have been reported. So among them are things like speech disturbances, memory impairment, aggression, mania, hypomania, hypersexuality, pathological gambling, changes in mood, depression, increased suicide risk, and personality changes. And so part of what I was interested in is what happens with these treatments. How does treating somebody with DBS change their agency in ways that are expected, for instance, alleviate some of the motor problems that can happen with Parkinson's, but what kinds of other changes co-occur with those, and what kinds of effects does that have on people's agency, including things like authenticity and what some philosophers call personal identity, but the way in which people change over time or stay the same over time. So the overarching idea of the project is to develop a tool, the agency assessment tool, which is essentially a bunch of survey questions and behavioral tasks so the survey questions are some subjective measure of agency, they're self-report, but then behavioral tasks can give you more insight into objective properties of things like inhibition, or sense of agency, or attitudes towards risk, et cetera. So we're working on integrating behavioral tasks with these survey questions. And the idea is to pilot this assay on groups of normal people, or let's say people who don't have any kind of identified disorder, and groups that have various neuropsychiatric disorders. And then to try to use machine learning techniques to identify aspects of the AAT that are predictive of various disorders. And then the idea would be, once we have a basic tool to work with, use it with different patient groups and people undergoing different kinds of neuro interventions to see if you can characterize what happens with these kinds of treatments. And also to use the data in order to try to find and characterize emergent axes of agency. In particular, this grant aims to use the AAT to characterize DBS patients before and after surgery, and ideally to produce or to develop a database that people from all over can access and put their data in order to better understand how deep brain stimulation in Parkinson's works with individual neuroanatomy and with different stimulation sites and parameters. The other thing that it can allow us to do is to basically visualize agentive space and help patients to visualize their own agentive space and help them make decisions about how to treat their own illness. So let me briefly, so to briefly describe how we started this, as I said, we're envisioning agency space as this multi-dimensional space. We can't really start in a completely neutral way. So what we did is we started by looking at the philosophical literature, at case reports from clinical symptoms, at validated diagnostic tools, and to try to distill these kinds of ideas and insights into a survey of questions and a bunch of behavioral tests, and administer them to patients. And so we have a provisional set of candidate axes. Not that much rides on what they're called, but they're sort of grouped together in thematic ways, and they involve different kinds of control, like motor control, thought control, behavioral control, emotional control, decision-making abilities, different kinds of personality characteristics, attitudes towards risk, reflectiveness, attitudes toward morality and responsibility, and philosophical worldview questions, etc. And I wanted to just mention that this way of sort of thinking about agency as a a space that has very different dimensions that can vary on a spectrum, is very much in line with the new RDoC matrix, the way in which the NIH is conceiving of psychiatric disorders, where things have more, they're viewed as a spectrum, and they're broken into different kinds of systems, and including negative and positive valence systems and cognitive systems and social processes, et cetera. And this is an attempt to be more neuroscientific and less prescriptive about how to identify different kinds of psychiatric disorders. So I think that the general overarching idea of both the RDoC and our project are sort of getting at the same kinds of underlying views about what agency is and the way in which brain changes can change people's behavior. So the underlying hypothesis is sort of that agency is a framework for understanding neuropsychiatric disease. So in our test, we have people, since we're using mostly mTurk and Qualtrics participants, we have to rely on self-reported diagnoses, but we ask about people's diagnosis of mood disorder, anxiety, or eating disorder, OCD, psychosis, PTSD, et cetera, in order to try to see if we can identify signatures of agency that help us predict whether people have any of these kinds of disorders. And so just sort of a cartoon would show that that we would be able to see differences between like normal and people who have a certain kind of disorder on certain kinds of dimensions and or the shape of their agency space. And that also, when we use this to look at people before and after treatment, we might be able to see changes in the shape of their agency space or their location in agency space before and after treatment. So we have very preliminary results. When we looked at different disorders, we could identify, that is, we could take the answers that people gave to the AAT and identify with approximately 75% accuracy whether or not they had any of these 6 disorders. So we view that as a proof of concept. But because we had to sort of sum agency scores across these predefined dimensions because of just we didn't have enough data to do things without doing so. We would expect that we could get better accuracy once we have enough data to look at individual questions as opposed to these sum dimensions. And we've also done some feature impact work to look at which aspects, which of these dimensions that we've previously identified are more predictive of certain kinds of disorders. So we used some machine learning to do this. And so this is just a quick example of one of these. So this is the model, machine learning model that we use for anxiety disorders. And the data essentially looked at that we could, with 75% accuracy, identify people who self-reported having had an anxiety disorder from the questions that they gave, not including these kinds of self-report questions, obviously. And that when we look at which kinds of features had the most impact, not surprisingly, emotional regulation came out as having the most impact for the identification of the anxiety disorders. That is, if you scramble the data for emotional regulation questions, you really cut down on the ability of the machine learning model to predict. So just to sort of summarize, what we have is this kind of abstract view of having multiple dimensions of agency. And the idea is to be able to characterize the space of normal agency by giving this to a lot of people who don't have any self-reported neuropsychiatric disorders, and then show differences of with the disorder of agency. So the shape of a disordered agency of a certain type may look different from, so the shape of agency for somebody who has anxiety disorder might look quite different from the shape of somebody who has OCD. And then we want to see whether that looks different after treatment. So can we chart the effects of treatment and show how it affects different aspects of agency? And then ultimately, as we said, we want to be able to use this to help people make their own decisions. So research on agency emphasizes that people have differing values and different self-conceptions. And so the idea is to help people visualize the potential outcomes of their treatment or the outcomes of the treatment that they've tried, and to incorporate the relative value that they attribute to various dimensions. So some people might think that, emotional regulation is really important, or that they really want to improve their inhibitory abilities or something like that. And maybe there's a way of dialing the treatment in particular ways to help them change their agency or regain agency in the ways in which it is most valuable to them. So just this is an example of what a rescaled agency profile might look like. So I think that we're in early stages, but I think that there's a lot of potential in this kind of approach. So with further work, a well-calibrated AAT could be used to create a common framework for agency, assisting both patients and medical providers in weighing treatment options and assessing results. And it could also be used to characterize and perhaps someday help diagnose various neuropsychiatric diseases conceived of as disorders of agency. But I just want to say this is very much a work in progress. And so finally, I think I'm just going to summarize the whole arc of the talk. So new conceptual work, I think this idea of the accumulator model undercuts one prominent argument against free will. The problem of free will, I think, matters to us because what we really care about is our agency, but we're still conceptually unclear about what agency is. We hypothesize that various neuropsychiatric disorders are fundamentally disorders that impact agency in particular ways. And if that's right, we can use these to clarify what agency is and to better understand the impact of disease and treatment on patient agency. And so in closing, I just want to thank my collaborators. So Ashley Walton is the postdoc that's done a lot of the AAT work, and Aaron Scherger and I wrote this TICS paper that talks about the impact of the accumulator model, but the accumulator model is really Aaron's baby, so I want to give him full credit for that. And with that, I think I will stop and take questions or however we want to pursue the rest of this. So I'm going to stop the share. I thought I stopped the share.
Yeah.
Marco Aurelio, feel free to jump in and.
Yeah, I can't turn my video on. Oh, no, I can't. All right, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, thank you, Adina, very much. Very interesting talk, a lot of things. And you covered a huge range of topics. So I don't have much of a question here, but maybe some considerations. I'm just curious of how you're gonna tackle with some issues I am personally interested in. And I must say that there are a lot of questions here from the audience, and Professor Gabriel and Professor Renato, they're going to ask questions themselves. So I'm going to be very short here. I don't want to take the word. You initiated your talk with this overview of the free will problem since Leibniz and how this evolved and how the classic Libet's experiments were explored in this debate. And I had the sense that after all that exposition, you got to this conclusion that as a matter of fact, neuroscience doesn't really have much to say about free will, because it depends a lot on the question of on whether or not determinism is a good metaphysical position, or whether or not it's a metaphysical truth. And that cannot be decided by anything that neuroscience can provide us. So my sense of your presentation is you present this whole debate on free will, and then you question Libet's experiments and the use of the redness potential, and you present the stochastic account, and then you go like, well, that's not going to lead anywhere. It's full of gaps. I mean, the metaphysical question is still unsolved, and it's not going to be solved, or you don't see how it could be solved going that way. And then you point to the concept of agency. And then what you presented, what you talked about agency, you developed this capacitarian view, which I like. I mean, obviously, you better think of agency as a matter of degree, not only in a single line scale, but as a multi-dimensional space as you propose. And then you go to the clinic and you gather data and you try to model a way of understanding this multi-dimensional nature of agency. And my question is very simple. How would this help with this the former debate? Because I think that they didn't get to the point of being able to even take a stake in the metaphysical debate. And I think that even if all this work on agency is accomplished, even though, of course, it's going to be very helpful to diagnosis of a lot of diseases and treatments, and I'm just concerned about how it could be in any way helpful to the debate on free will, or maybe not. Maybe the answer is no, I don't think it will. So I just want to hear from you. Thank you, Adina.
Yeah, thanks. That's actually a great question. So I do think that it's helpful to the debate on free will, because I don't think that the debate on free will, as it's characterized philosophically, is going to yield to neuroscience. But I think if you have some philosophical commitments, neuroscience can help you make progress. So I don't think neuroscience is not going to tell us whether or not determinism is true. And even if it did, we would still have the philosophical debate, because people differ on whether they think determinism matters to free will. So I think that they're unresolvable, empirically unresolvable philosophical questions. But suppose you are a compatibilist, right? Suppose you think determinism isn't the crux issue, but that you think that there are certain capacities that are important for neuroscience, for free will. Well, I think neuroscience has something to say about the nature of those capacities. So for instance, if you identify certain capacities and the neural systems that underlie them, you might be able to say, here's a person that has certain kind of brain damage. They could not have, controlled themselves, or their capacity is so diminished that they should not be held responsible in this kind of case, et cetera. So I think that there's an interplay between neuroscience and philosophy that could be very fruitful in figuring out, okay, what are the important capacities, and what are the natures of those capacities, and how can those capacities be damaged or influenced or whatever, such that in these particular circumstances, we might deny that somebody acted freely, et cetera. But I don't think that the sort of big question, like, is it possible for humans to have free will, is one that is going to be fruitfully addressed by neuroscience. So I think given certain kinds of commitments, we can ask questions that neuroscience can help answer, but not the question like, is it possible for us to be free?
And agency is going to help answering these questions. That's the bet.
Yeah, I mean, I think that what it is that we think is essential to agency is going to be the kind of thing that tells us whether somebody had the capacities to act freely in a certain situation, right? So, if I could say, this person does not this person with, who knows, elevated levels of this kind of neurotransmitter does not have the capacity to really act rationally, then that would be something that would be relevant to the question of whether they acted freely. If you think that, you know, rationality is an essential capacity for, you know, free, responsible, let's say, responsible action.
Right. Oh, sorry, just a follow-up, quick follow-up. And how do you think we can, of course, you gather data and you try to model the axis of this multi-dimensional space of agency based on, you know, information, data, real data. But don't you think that after all, the criteria for telling, given each of the, you know, dimensions that are considered to be relevant to evaluate the agency or the degree of agency of someone at a, you know, a certain dimension, pretty much depends on a lot of on some sort of intuition. Is it like an intuition gathering? Like we intuitively think that if people in this dimension lack this sort of ability, they lack agency or they have more or less agency. Is it like a collection of intuitions we have in this multi-dimensional space or not? I'm getting it totally wrong. What's the role played by intuition in modeling this?
Yeah, well, I think, again, I think it's a really good question. I think I was a little naive to think that, you know, we could do a sort of totally data-driven approach to agency, because the question of what to include in the survey in the first place has to be driven by something. So, you know, things that you don't measure aren't going to end up being part of your assay, right? We can measure things and decide, you know, that's really not telling us anything significant, or, you know, so we can choose to throw stuff out, but we can't add stuff in that we haven't already started. So we tried to start with, you know, very broad conceptions, but even in trying to, you know, suppose you have a big data set and you're trying to figure out what the primary factors are. Well, you have to make decisions about how many you can factor, but you have to decide how many factors, and then how many factors might be influenced by whether what comes out seems to match up with your intuitions at all. And so I think there's a real question about the relative role of intuition and empirical information in doing this kind of project. And I mean, the thing that's interesting, it sort of led me down a bit of a rabbit hole. So I started reading stuff about ontology, scientific ontology, and how it is that you know, things like temperature came to be, how the science of temperature was started, and it's sort of a constant interplay between intuition and theory and experiment and a revision of intuition and theory. And I think that we'll be in that kind of position where none of it is purely intuition free, but your intuitions can be sharpened or changed or altered by certain kinds of empirical information and advances and stuff. So yeah, it's philosophically a really interesting question, you know, how to bootstrap yourself to a scientific theory, if you can.
But that's fair enough. I mean, that's a problem to anyone. That's a trade-off. I understand. You use intuition and use data, and there's no way out of it. You have to combine it some way. Well, I'm going to let Professor Renato ask the question now.
Professor Adina, thank you very much for your talk. Very, very interesting. I'm going to go back to the beginning of your talk, your presentation, because I once was a diehard fan of Libet style, Libet paradigm experiments, and the second part of your talk pretty much summarizes everything that made me change my mind. The stochastic model has definitely changed my mind on that. I still think there's good reason to question a lot, and the neuroscience of free will has to maybe leave Libet behind for a while and explore new ways, and that I'm totally in agreement with you. But I would like to ask one question. This is philosophical. In the beginning, there is this position by Pereboom of hard incompatibilism, and he kind of drifts away from that position. Basically, what he asks is, this determinism question, it does not really change anything for the free will debate, and he defends hard incompatibilism. And he basically says that incompatibilism, that indeterminism does not grant free will at all, and at max, at best, it would grant randomness. So I would really like to know your position about this, because you did not touch on that specific position in your slide in the beginning, and I'd really like to know about that. Thank you very much.
Yeah, no, I agree. So I agree with Dirk on that matter. I mean, I think that indeterminism doesn't leave you in a better position with respect to intuitions about free will. I think Dirk, I think, what Dirk does is hold to the, sort of classic view of free will as having to be outside the causal order. And then given that, is willing to say, okay, it's just not possible. And I take the other approach. And I think that concept of free will is incoherent. And so what we have is, we have to sort of naturalize our notion of free will so that it is something that's attainable. It's something that we have in virtue of having these various kinds of capacities. It doesn't matter whether or not determinism or indeterminism is true. What matters is that we possess certain kinds of capacities and exercise them in certain cases. But yeah, so I think we both agree that I think what we disagree on is what free will should mean in order to say whether or not we have it. And I'm willing to allow that we can exercise free will, and he is going to hold to the very strict definition of free will and say that it's not possible at all.
Thank you very much.
Okay, now Gabriel.
Hi, Adina. Thank you very much for your talk. It's impressive how you cover exactly the topic of our event. You really talk about free will, agency, and its ethical implications. That was really impressive. I have two questions. One more historically driven, and other one there's more about cutting edge research that I'd like to see how would you interpret. The more historically driven question, both of them about RPs, readiness potential. So the first question is, would you agree that the difference between readiness potential type 1 and readiness potential type 2 is the main discovery of Libet? Would you agree that even with many follow-ups, is exploring this issue, the causal relevance of pre-planning is still incipiently explored? And the second question is a little bit trickier. Recent studies from the relationship between neuroscience and physical education, sports physiology, have a lot to say about readiness potential. There is a research that I think it's really interesting, comparing novice and experts archers, and I mean they are releasing preceded larger herpes amplitudes and later herpes onsets in more skilled archers than in novices. I mean, this is quite a striking result. As well, we have other articles showing, for example, that karate experts have also stronger herpes than fencing athletes. And there's also connections showing the more attention you have, the less herpes amplitude you have. I'd like to see how, I mean, you see those results, because it seems that herpes is something that evolution equipped us with to just interact with the environment, and it's a kind of an activist question, somehow not a radical and activist question, but kind of an activist question. I mean, if you're done, I mean, the importance of the herpes is fast responses to the environment, isn't it? Thanks.
Great, thank you for the questions. So the first question about the type 1 and type 2 RPs. So I don't know about how to assess the importance of the identification of type 1 and type 2 RPs. It seems like he did show that when there is pre-planning, the RP begins earlier. Another way of saying it, if you're thinking about it in an accumulator model, is that the decision process begins earlier or takes more time when you're carefully planning something. And I don't know that that's, I know that the pre-planning relationship to the length of the RP or the timing of the onset of the RP is a pretty robust phenomenon, but it hasn't been, as far as I know, identified as it hasn't been something that people have really paid that much attention to. So while it may turn out to be the most important thing that he did, I don't think that it's been recognized as the most important thing that he did.
My question is if pre-planning somewhat does not imply consciousness. Because planning is a conscious mental action. I mean,
sure. Yeah, so I think that the thing is that we don't know what these signals are averaging over. So just the mere fact that when you start thinking about something earlier, you see an RP develop earlier, it doesn't tell you where the signal is coming from or what kind of process it's reflecting. And so until we have some way of understanding that, I don't know how illuminating it's going to be. So there's certainly a correlation between the length of time that one is aware of doing something and the length of time that the RP occurs, but it isn't clear that we're looking at the same signals in those cases. So, so the second question about the sports, I didn't know all of those sport-related findings. It's interesting. And again, I don't know how to interpret them. I mean, I take it you can interpret them just on the basis of the finding that you relayed, but whether those things allow you to derive something general about the nature and importance of the RP, that I'm much less clear on. I don't know really what to say. There are also findings about noise reduction in the RP, and you might think that would be an important aspect of some kind of sports expertise. But it's, yeah, I think I can't really say what the relevance of those data are for things like free will. I mean, it's clear that the brain is doing something before we act, right? But it isn't clear exactly what is going on and how to sort of attribute the signal to various kinds of processes. So.
Thanks a lot. Marco, feel free to read the questions for the audience. There's a bunch of questions. Santiago Amaya, Marcelo Fishborn, Nitamar Oliveira, Paulo Abrantes, and there's a question also of a student. Feel free to take in the way you prefer.
All right. I am going to start with a question by Nitamar Fernandes de Oliveira, who is a professor from the Catholic University of Rio Grande do Sul in Brazil. And his question is, usually people think of free will as an individual thing, a cognitive liberty that allows for both privacy and agency. Now, how would you account for intersubjective social components to a conception of freedom, such as those investigated by so-called social brain research programs, such as Gazaniga's and others? So that's the question.
Can I ask for clarification about what the social conception of free will is? Because I'm not sure I'm familiar with.
Well, he gives us an example, Gazaniga's and others, as so-called social brain research programs.
Yeah. I feel like I'm at a loss in the sense that.
Oh, is Nitama in the room? Maybe he can explain himself.
I think I see his name.
Yeah.
Hi, Professor Roskies.
Hi, how are you?
Fine. Thanks again for this brilliant talk. It was very much thought-provoking. Yeah, as Marco just read, I was just wondering, what would you make of the social dimension to this whole thing of self-identity and the way individual brains would respond to a given situation, precisely considering the way someone has been conditioned in different ways?
So I think there's certainly lots of different influences on the way in which our brains develop that may have relevant causal impact on, the kinds of decisions we make. I think that we actually expect that to be true, in the sense that if nothing in our past had any bearing on our future, I think we would consider ourselves less free, right? If you didn't expect that your values and your education and all those things informed your decision making, and your decision making was just random, then I think we would consider ourselves not free or less free. And so I think given the capacitarian view, provided that you have developed or retained certain kinds of capacities, even if your socialization or the influences of your peers or whatever are affecting, have some kind of causal trace on your decision making, I don't think that undermines your ability to decide freely. So again, I don't think we need to be aware of all of the causal influences on our actions. And I also think that that it's necessary that there are these sort of causal influences that depend on all kinds of things that we identify ourselves with, whether it's our past experiences or our values or beliefs or the people we identify with, etc. All of those things come into play as influences and reasons in our decision making, and that seems to be the way it should be. So I don't know that I consider any of the social stuff to undermine people's ability to decide and act freely.
All right, thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, I think I'm going to do the following. I have some questions from the audience, and they are not in this room. As you might know, only the coolest cats are in here, right? So, and I see two people in the room, Marcelo Fishborn and Santiago Amaya, who raised their hands. But I'm going to do the following. Instead of giving the word to people, to the cool cats, and then go to the people in the audience, I'm going to go one from the audience, one from here, and then I'm gonna give the word to whoever is raising the hand here. So that's not, I think it's gonna be less tiring because then I read a question and then someone reads or asks, his or her own question. So I'm gonna read now this question from a grad student from PUC-Rio, the Catholic University of Rio de Janeiro, named Luan Marques. He has two questions. The first one is a question about how to understand determinism. One way of understanding determinism is that given the loss, the remote past is sufficient for the present state of the universe. But we also understand determinism as a view that each moment is determined by the moment that comes immediately before it. Are these compatible? So that's the first question. And the second one, question on the long scale choices critique of Libet's experiment. Well, is the idea that it's long scale choices or plans that matter independent on the truth of Libet's thesis? In other words, can long scale conscious planes be relevantly free even if immediate choices are in fact unconscious? So those are the two questions. You wanted me to repeat the first one? Are you good?
I think I'm good. So yes, those two ways of thinking of determinism are equivalent, because what you need is any description of the universe at any time t plus all the laws gives you the description at some other time t2. And so you can fill in your times as you want, whether it's remote past or the immediate preceding moment. So they are essentially the same. They're just emphasizing different time.
Oh, good. And what about the second one on the long scale choices and the Libet's experiment? Oh, is she frozen?
Yeah, I think Adina is frozen.
Well, let's wait if she gets back here. Well, I think she was about to answer the second question and she got frozen, right?
Yeah, these things happen.
Right.
She'll come back soon.
Right. Renato, you can answer yourself if you if you will.
I wouldn't dare answering for Adina, not ever.
He can answer for me because he's my legal representative. Yeah, let's wait for Adina. I mean, that type of thing happens sometimes, and I think she'll be back as soon as possible.
Well, you can tell some neuro jokes.
Adina is there. Adina is there.
All right.
She's back.
She's back.
Yo.
That was unfortunate. Everything just cut out completely. Okay, so let me just finish my answer. I think that the question is whether the long time scale stuff allows us to be free, even if the short time scale stuff doesn't. But what I was arguing is that there's nothing to suggest that the short time scale stuff doesn't anyway. But I would say that yes, if it were the case, which I think is not the case, that Libet showed that the short time scale stuff doesn't allow us to be free, the long time scale stuff still does. So.
All right. Now I I think Santiago Amaya was the first one. I
Yeah,
don't
was the
remember.
first one, please.
Yeah.
Let him talk.
Please, Santiago.
Hello,
Good to see
Adina.
you. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you, and thank you for the talk. That's a great talk. I have lots of things that I want to talk to you about, the conception of agency as multidimensional, but I want to ask just one question of the ethical implications of the proposals right now. And the question is this: so people working in feminist philosophy worry sometimes about what they call the agency dilemma. And I want to ask you if you worry about the dilemma and if you think it's a worry that applies to the view that you're defending. So the agency dilemma essentially goes something like this. So the more you seek to recognize the situations of oppression and deprivation that people live under, the harder it is to acknowledge and respect their agency. And this is an objection that Serene Kader has brought up, say, in connection with discussions of adaptive preferences. I wonder if you worry a little bit, especially given the relation you find between the picture of agency and neuropsychiatric disorders. So the more we recognize those disorders and the more we think of them as disorders that impact agency, the harder it is to recognize the agency of those who are suffering this kind of disorders.
Yeah, well, I think I'm not sure that I agree. So in a sense, it's, I think, the fact that there are so many dimensions to agency that if you identify particular dimensions that are impacted, that doesn't mean that there are many others that aren't impacted, or there may be some that are augmented in particular ways. And so I think that what I prefer to think about, rather than when you think about a multidimensional space, it's easy to think about, let's say, the origin of that space and measuring agency as certain distance from that origin, and then then it's like a small step to more agency and less agency. I think a better way to think about it is to think about adaptive, or good and bad, or preferable and less preferable parts of that space, where there may be sort of maladaptive regions of that space that you would like to move yourself out of, and then other regions that it would be good to be in, or better to move towards. And those things might be context dependent, where there might be certain situations in which a space that is, or a point in space that is maladaptive, let's say in one society, might be better in a different society. So I think getting away from the more or less, or better, or more is better and less is worse kind of idea, to just thinking more holistically about, here are sort of happy parts of agency space, here are less happy parts. And, the reason that we think of these disorders as being diseases or disorders is because they're maladaptive, right? And so there's lots of room for individual variability, but then there are going to be also spaces where the individual variability turns out not to be working in your favor. And so knowing where those spaces are and knowing how to move out of those spaces, I think, is something that we want to do. But I don't know that necessarily we need to be thinking of people as non-agents. Does that help?
Right. I'm going to read the question by Paula Brantz, a professor from the University of Brasilia. Thank you for your talk. Do you think the accumulator model is compatible with a natural selection-like model working inside the brain mind, we might have multiple levels of variation and selection. What goes with what I think is your belief in the existence of multiple levels involved in causing a decision or an action?
I certainly think there are multiple accumulator type processes going on. And I mean, you can record from brain areas and see dynamics that are consistent with accumulator type models, and they're in different brain areas. And it could be that multiple ones are running in parallel. It could be that context tells you which ones are being used or read out. So I certainly think that it would be overly simplistic to think that there's a single accumulator. So I think of the accumulator model as a sort of localist description of something that's probably much more complicated than that. But I'm not sure what the selectionist question is, though.
I'm just going to repeat the last part. We might have multiple levels of variation and selection. What goes with what I think is your belief in the existence of multiple levels involved in causing a decision or an action?
Yeah, I mean, the brain is multiple levels. It's many, many levels of hierarchy, and there may be lots of different accumulators that are involved in any single process. So I think we don't know enough to identify the entire circuit of any kind of real decision-making process. We can identify relevant circuits, in particular, very, pared down decision-making processes, but that doesn't really correspond to real life. So I think that there's just a lot to learn, but I would expect that yes, there's going to be many levels of the hierarchy, and something like an accumulator is going to be important, probably at a variety of levels.
All right, now Marcelo Fishborn, you ready?
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah. Hi.
Okay, hi Adina, thanks for your talk. I have two questions about the last parts about the agency assessment tool that you are developing. I think it's a very interesting project. And the first question is about whether or not it's supposed to be a self-report or something to be the person will herself fulfill or respond. And in that case, I have questions about what I would call the limits of introspection, to what extent people can reliably tell something about certain aspects of their mental lives. And a second question is about, I think maybe one dimension of agency that could be present in an assessment tool like that one is what I would call a responsibility profile. There has been some research suggesting that in certain neuropsychiatric conditions, people respond to being held responsible in different ways. An example is depression. So people with depression may be highly sensitive to punishment, but have low sensitivity to being rewards to what they do. And that has been reported in other conditions as well. So you mentioned the go-no-go task and things like that, that maybe have to do not with strictly agency, but how people, when they act, how they react after being held responsible by other people. antisocial personality disorder. People have tendency not to respond to the punishment, and they keep on the same kind of action. So my question is about that. Could there be a responsibility profile as part of the agency assessment tool? So thanks again.
Thanks. Great questions. The first question is definitely there are limitations because it is self-report, and we have to hope that the people who are filling out the AAT are at least being sincere, and indeed, I think people will have different levels of introspective access, and so the data is going to be noisy. The reason that we're including some of these behavioral measures is just really to try and see if there are, to the extent that we can, integrate more objective kinds of measures. I think that would help, but I don't see any way of getting around the self-report problem. So we just decided to go with it and see what we could get out of it. Sorry, the second one about the responsibility profile, we ask certain kinds of questions that might get added a little bit, but I think probably nothing pointed enough to be able to do it. And I don't know how I would operationalize something where we would actually get data as to how people reacted, rather than just ask them something like, how do you react to punishment? And then I think, again, there's always a question of whether you're getting good data. So we've asked things like, do you hold other people responsible for certain kinds of things? Do you hold yourself responsible in the same way that you hold other people responsible? Things like that. But I guess we haven't asked specifically about responses to punishment. I think that would be interesting. The problem is that agency is so broad, and there's so many things that you'd like to ask people. And also these behavioral tasks take time to get enough data to make sense of the data. And there's just so much time that somebody's willing to spend doing this. So there's really a tension between what we'd like to know and signal to noise ratios, and the ability to have somebody pay attention and cooperate for that long, especially with some of these disorders like the Parkinson's that we want to take this to. It's even harder for them to do an online test because of their motor problems and sometimes cognitive issues. And so we're trying to walk a fine line between getting the data that we want and being able to even get people to be our subjects. So I think it's challenging. It's definitely like the practical limitations are more challenging than I anticipated on the front end. Thanks, Marcelo.
All right, Gabriel, the section ends at 4 p.m., right? Brasilia time.
Exactly. You have time maybe for one or two more questions, and then we close the session. We come back after a half an hour break for a coffee break.
Okay.
Break.
So let's see if we can cover one or two questions here. I'm going to go first to this question by Gracie Moraes. I'm going to read it. Thank you very much for the talk. I would like to share some thoughts about this interface between neuroscience and philosophical questions. As a neuroscientist, we must be very careful on using neuroscience to explain or predict free will related behaviors or to entirely answer a philosophical question, because the brain is plastic after all. Unless there is something structural or genetic, basically everything else is learnable. So that's the question. I think it's more of comment, right?
Sounds like a comment. I agree. I mean, even genetic stuff, there's quite a lot of plasticity in whether, you know, something could be in your genes but not expressed, and it can be modified. So I think that there's quite a lot of plasticity no matter what.
Mm-hmm. Right. I have some questions here in Portuguese, Gabriel. We have the simultaneous translator. I don't know if I translate on the go here, if I try to do it, or if I...
I think it's better if you translate on the go, because people will have to change channels. I think it's easier if you translate on the go.
All right. So let me see one of those. Okay, Daniel Jr. Good afternoon. My name is Daniel Jr. I'm an undergrad student in philosophy at the Federal University of the Rural University in Rio de Janeiro, Rural University. Which would be your conception of free will within the divine context? Science can deal with a neuroscientific pattern to cognitive responses in connection to, oh my God, that's confused. Maybe I'm going to read it in Portuguese first, because I can't do it on the go, because I don't know what's coming next, right? I'm going to read it.
I got the question. The question is, how can we align cognitive responses and patterns in neuroscientific research with a context influence of theological or divine issues in terms of freedom of choice? That's a kind of the general taste of the question.
I don't know that I have very much to say. I mean, I operate in a naturalistic framework, and you know, all I can say is that the problem of free will was first raised as a theological problem. If God is all-knowing, then how can we be free? And then theologians have been trying to answer that for a long time, and I think that the question is just in a different guise with determinism. Foreknowledge and determinism are sort of interchangeable, and I think that what I would say is neither of those is really where the action is. The action has to be on capacities, and I think the same would be true whether you were thinking about it scientifically or in theological terms. But I think I'll leave it at that.
Marco, before you close the session, Thomas Nadelhofer was trying to. I mean, he was having issues with Zoom, but he was willing to propose a question as well. I don't know, Thomas, are you hearing us? If you want to jump,
no.
Hi, Thomas.
Yeah, sure, please.
Hey, Adina, how are you?
Good.
That was great. No, I didn't so much have a question. It's just when I opened the Q&A to look at it, I can read them, but I can't add my own Q. And sometimes that's easier than, you know, because then I can put it out and maybe it gets talked about or it doesn't get talked about. But for some reason I can see them. I can raise my hand, so that's fine. If I had a question to ask right away, I could have just asked it. But I can't pose one in the Q&A for some reason. That's all. But no, it was fine. I didn't have really a pressing question.
Yeah, I think sometimes that people that are in the panel can't access Q&A. I've had that happen to me sometimes.
Makes sense. That's fine.
Gabriel, one very quick last question from Luan Marques, and this one is in English. It's the same student, the grad student from Catholic University of Rio de Janeiro, The question is, one way to understand a position is by telling what it's arguing against. When it comes to the capacity approach to agency, it looks at first sight pretty obvious. Are there alternative non-capacity approaches to your position argues against?
Well, in some sense, the capacitarian approach is quite general. So the sort of standard philosophy of free will question has often been raised in terms of the capacity to do otherwise. And I don't think that that's the best formulation of the capacitarian approach. So what I suggest instead is that what the capacities we care about should be are certain kinds of cognitive capacities. So, capacity to weigh reasons, the capacity to inhibit your actions, the capacity to understand moral discourse, moral concepts, things like that. So yeah, I think there's some version in which everything is a capacity question, but I want to shift the focus from the capacity to do otherwise to a bunch of cognitive capacities.
All right, so I'm going to let Gabriel close the section. I just want to thank you, Adina, very much.
Adina, thanks a lot. That was a priceless contribution to our event. I think that was just brilliant. We are very happy. And we come back in half an hour. You just have to log in again, everyone. We've closed the session. We start a new session. Same link, same everything. And we have now half an hour for drinking some water and rest a bit, because we have just afterwards Renato and Beatriz, and I know that those talks will be great as well. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks, Gabriel. Gabriel, you know that this is scheduled at the very same time as the